It is a sweltering mid-afternoon in Singapore, the kind of day where the humidity hangs in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on the manicured lawns of the Istana, the official residence and working office of the Prime Minister. Inside the deep colonial-era building, the air conditioning hums with a comforting artificial chill, creating a sanctuary against the tropical heat. In a high-ceilinged room, Kuan sits across from a visiting dignitary, perhaps a senior cabinet minister or a foreign envoy from a friendly Western power. The conversation is grave. They are discussing matters of state survival, military procurement, delicate negotiations with Malaysia, or perhaps the internal security threats that lurk within the city-state's own borders. Papers are spread across the mahogany desk, and the guest leans in to whisper a crucial piece of information, lowering his voice instinctively to match the gravity of the secret. But before the sentence can be finished, Kuan raises a hand, abruptly stopping the flow of words. He pushes his chair back, the sound echoing slightly in the stillness of the room, and stands up. He looks at his guest with an expression that brooks no argument, and issues a command that seems utterly baffling in the context of a high-level diplomatic meeting. "Let us go for a walk." The guest is momentarily stunned. To leave the refrigerated comfort of the office for the suffocating furnace of the Singaporean afternoon seems like an act of madness, or perhaps a strange power play designed to test physical endurance. But one does not refuse Kuan. They step out of the heavy wooden doors and onto the veranda, and the heat hits them instantly, a wall of moist, heavy air that instantly begins to bead on their foreheads and dampen their shirts. They descend the steps into the sprawling, lush gardens of the Istana. As they walk away from the building, the silence of the office is replaced by a cacophony of natural and urban noise. The screech of tropical cicadas is deafening, a relentless, high-pitched drill that permeates the atmosphere. In the distance, the low rumble of heavy traffic from Orchard Road provides a baseline to the insect choir. Nearby, a fountain splashes aggressively into a pool. To the average observer, this is simply the soundscape of a tropical city. To Kuan, it is something far more valuable. It is a shield. As they walk along the gravel paths, the guest moves to speak again, but Lee gestures for them to keep moving, further away from the main building, further away from the trees that line the perimeter. He does not stop until they are in an open space, exposed to the sun but enveloped by the chaotic noise of the environment. Only then does he signal that it is safe to talk. This ritual, repeated time and again over the decades, was not born of eccentricity. It was born of a terrifying realization that Kuan had come to early in his tenure as Prime Minister. Inside his own country, inside his own palace, he was not alone. He understood that in the modern world, silence was not a luxury, it was a vulnerability. In a quiet room, a voice carries. In a quiet room, sound waves hit the window panes and cause them to vibrate imperceptibly. And Kuan knew with the cold certainty of a man who read every intelligence report he could get his hands on, that his friends possessed the technology to read those vibrations from a mile away. The paranoia that drove Kuan into the garden was not the delusion of a madman, but the calculated caution of a survivor. He was acutely aware that Singapore sat at the crossroads of the Cold War. It was a strategic prize, a listening post for the world's intelligence agencies. While the public face of diplomacy involved handshakes and state dinners with the United States and Great Britain, Lee knew the darker truth of international relations. There are no friends in the spy game, only targets. He knew that the Central Intelligence Agency and Britain's MI6 were voracious consumers of information. They didn't just want to know what their enemies were thinking, they needed to know what their allies were thinking. They needed to know if Lee was pivoting toward China, if he was secretly cutting deals with Indonesia, or if the Singaporean economy was on the brink of collapse. To get this information, they would not ask politely. They would steal it. Kuan's knowledge of surveillance technology was surprisingly deep. He was a man who respected science, and he kept himself abreast of the latest developments in espionage tradecraft. He knew about the big ear, the ability of parabolic microphones to snatch a conversation out of the air from rooftops hundreds of meters away. He knew about the laser microphone, a piece of Cold War wizardry where an invisible beam of light is fired at a glass window. When people speak inside the room, the pressure of their voices causes the glass to vibrate on a microscopic level. The laser beam bounces off the vibrating glass and returns to the receiver, where the modulations are decoded back into sound. A private conversation held behind soundproof glass in a secure office could be listened to by an agent sitting in a van 3 streets away, clear as a bell. The very walls of the Astana, built by the British colonial administration, were suspect. Who knew what wires had been buried in the plaster during the renovations? Who knew which telephone line had a secondary tap that fed directly to a recorder in the American embassy? This knowledge created a profound psychological siege mentality. Imagine being the leader of a nation, responsible for the lives of millions, and realizing that you cannot speak freely in your own office. Imagine looking at the telephone on your desk, not as a tool of communication, but as a traitorous ear waiting to betray you. Lee Kuan Yew realized that he could not outspend the CIA on technology. He could not build a bunker deep enough or buy encryption expensive enough to guarantee total privacy against the resources of a superpower. So, he turned to physics. He turned to the chaotic randomness of nature. The garden strategy was a low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. The overwhelming noise of the cicadas and the traffic acted as white noise, a natural jammer that scrambled the frequencies of directional microphones. By walking constantly, never staying in a fixed position, he made it impossible for a laser to maintain a steady lock on a reflective surface. He was using the humidity, the bugs, and the noise of his city to blind the electronic eyes of the West. The irony of the situation was stark. Singapore was, on paper, a staunch anti-communist partner. It allowed American ships to dock. It traded with London and New York. Yet here was its prime minister, sweating through his shirt in a garden, whispering state secrets to avoid the prying ears of the very nations that claimed to protect him. It revealed the fundamental cynicism that lay at the heart of Lee Kuan Yew's worldview. He understood that in geopolitics, trust is a fatal weakness. He knew that the Americans viewed him as a difficult ally, too independent, too sharp, too unwilling to bend the knee. He knew they wanted leverage over him. If they could record him disparaging a neighboring leader or admitting to a domestic weakness, they could use that tape to pressure him in negotiations. They could blackmail the state. So, the garden became his fortress. It was a scene that played out dozens of times. The powerful leader, small in stature but immense in presence, pacing the gravel paths, wiping sweat from his brow, while the diplomat beside him struggled to keep up and hear the conversation over the roar of the cicadas. It was a test of loyalty for his subordinates and a message to his enemies. By forcing the meeting outside, Lee was signaling that he knew the game. He was telling the invisible listeners in the vans and the embassies that he was one step ahead. He was dragging the dark arts of espionage into the sunlight, stripping the spies of their technological advantage. The garden meetings were not just a quirk, they were a declaration of sovereignty. They were the physical manifestation of Lee Kuan Yew's ultimate doctrine, that Singapore belonged to no one but itself, and its secrets would not be surrendered to a machine, no matter how advanced, as long as there was a garden to walk in and a chaotic world to hide the sound of his voice. To understand the depth of Lee Kuan Yew's caution, one must first strip away the modern image of Singapore as a sterile, gleaming financial hub and transport oneself back to the gritty, neon-lit labyrinth of the 1960s and 70s. In those volatile decades, Singapore was not merely a port city, it was the Casablanca of the East. Just as Berlin was the epicenter of espionage in Europe, where the tectonic plates of NATO and the Warsaw Pact ground against each other, Singapore was the primary fault line of intelligence in Southeast Asia. It was a city where the humidity trapped secrets as effectively as it trapped heat, a place where the geopolitical interests of the world's great empires collided in the lobbies of the Raffles Hotel and the backrooms of smoky noodle houses. For the intelligence agencies of the world, the CIA, the British MI6, the Soviet KGB, and the Chinese MSS, Singapore was the ultimate playground. It was an open city, a free port where sailors, merchants, diplomats, and spies mingled freely, creating a chaotic environment where information was the most valuable commodity of all. And sitting at the very center of this spiderweb, the ultimate prize for every listening post from Langley to Moscow, was Lee Kuan Yew. The reason for this intense surveillance interest was primarily geography. Singapore sits at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, guarding the Malacca Strait, the jugular vein of the global economy. Through this narrow channel passed the oil that fueled Japan's economic miracle. the rubber that shod the armies of the West, and the tin that built the modern world. Whoever controlled Singapore, or at least understood the mind of its leader, held the keys to the Pacific. For the United States, deeply entrenched in the quagmire of the Vietnam War, Singapore was a vital logistical rear base. For the British, it was the last bastion of their fading empire east of Suez. For the Soviets and the Chinese, it was the domino that, if tipped, could turn the entire region red. Consequently, knowing what Kuan was thinking was not just a matter of diplomatic curiosity, it was a matter of strategic survival. The CIA did not view wiretapping him as a crime. They viewed it as a necessity of national security. However, the obsession with monitoring Kuan went beyond mere geography. It was personal. Lee was a geopolitical anomaly, a leader who defied the binary categorizations of the Cold War. To the West, he was a paradox that kept analysts awake at night. On one hand, he was a fierce anti-communist who imprisoned leftists and courted American investment. He spoke impeccable English, played golf, and understood the British legal system better than most Britons. But on the other hand, he was an ethnic Chinese leader who refused to be a puppet. He maintained a back-channel dialogue with Beijing at a time when China was the ultimate boogeyman of the West. He criticized American foreign policy in Vietnam with stinging accuracy. He was not a client state leader, like the dictators in South Vietnam or the Philippines, who simply took orders in exchange for aid. Lee was independent, prickly, and intellectually formidable. This terrified the Americans. They needed to know, was he truly on our side? Or was he secretly cutting a deal with Mao Zedong? Was his public criticism of the US just theater, or was he preparing to evict the Western military forces? The only way to answer these questions was to get inside his head, and the closest thing to getting inside his head was getting inside his office. The vulnerability of Singapore in this era was exacerbated by its very success. The city was in the throes of a massive modernization drive. To the casual observer, the forests of cranes dominating the skyline and the constant thud of pile drivers were symbols of economic progress. To the technical divisions of the CIA and MI6, however, they were golden opportunities. Singapore was literally being wired for the future. Miles of copper telephone cables were being laid, new government ministries were being constructed. The Astana itself was undergoing renovations to suit the new republic. In the world of espionage, the construction phase is the golden hour for infiltration. It is infinitely easier to install a bugging device when a building is a skeleton of concrete and steel than when it is finished and guarded. The intelligence agencies exploited this ruthlessly. The contracts to modernize Singapore's telecommunications infrastructure often went to Western companies, many of which had deep, quiet ties to their respective national intelligence services. It was an open secret in the spy world that British Telecom or American contractors would routinely leave back doors in the switchboards they installed abroad. A technician fixing a line in the Ministry of Defense could easily slip a passive tap into the junction box. A contractor installing air conditioning ducts in the Prime Minister's office could hide a microphone that would run off the building's own power supply, transmitting indefinitely. The very infrastructure of the state was being built by the people who wanted to spy on it. Kuan was acutely aware of this. He knew that every new telephone that rang on his desk was a potential traitor. He knew that the blueprints of his government buildings were likely sitting in a file in London or Washington before the cement had even dried in Singapore. Furthermore, the human terrain of Singapore made it a nest of spies. The city was swarming with diplomats, whose actual job descriptions were far murkier. The American Embassy on Napier Road and the British High Commission were bloated with staff attached to the CIA and MI6 stations. These were not enemies, they were liaison officers. They drank with Singaporean police chiefs, played tennis with rising politicians, and offered training and equipment to the fledgling Singaporean intelligence services. This proximity was a double-edged sword. While it provided Singapore with valuable assistance, it also allowed the foreign agencies to map the human network of the government. They knew who was in debt, who was having an affair, and who was disgruntled. They used this access to plant human assets, but their hunger for the raw, unfiltered thoughts of the Prime Minister remained insatiable. They wanted the take from the source. The specific anxiety of the Americans regarding China cannot be overstated. In the 1960s and 70s, the fear of the yellow peril merging with red communism was the dominant nightmare of Washington. They saw Lee Kuan Yew as a man walking a tightrope. When Lee visited China or spoke about the Asian way, the tape recorders in the US Embassy spun faster. They needed to verify his loyalty. Was he passing Western secrets to Zhou Enlai? Was he negotiating a secret non-aggression pact? The paranoia was mutual. The Americans were paranoid about Lee's ethnicity and independence. Lee was paranoid about the Americans' clumsiness and arrogance. He knew that if the CIA misunderstood a private conversation, they might trigger a coup or economic sanctions against him. He knew that the British, bitter about the loss of their colony, were monitoring him to see if he would fail. Thus, the Singapore of this era was a glass house. The walls were thin, and the neighbors were watching with binoculars. Lee Kuan Yew's realization that he was the most wiretapped man in Asia was not a flight of fancy. It was a cold assessment of his market value. He was the gatekeeper of the East, and in the high-stakes poker game of the Cold War, everyone wanted to see his cards. The physical transformation of Singapore, the new concrete, the glass towers, the underground cables, provided the perfect cover for this electronic invasion. The enemy was not landing on the beaches. The enemy was embedded in the telephone receiver, hiding in the ceiling tiles, and listening through the window panes. Lee Kuan Yew understood that before he could build a nation, he had to secure a sanctuary where his voice belonged only to him, and that realization would drive him out of the boardroom and into the garden. The roots of Lee Kuan Yew's profound suspicion of electronic surveillance did not begin with the arrival of the American CIA in the chaotic days of the Cold War. They were planted much earlier, in the deep, fertile soil of the British colonial administration. To understand the genesis of his paranoia, one must appreciate the complex, almost Oedipal relationship Lee had with the British. He was, in many ways, their creation. He was Harry Lee, educated at Cambridge, a man who spoke English with a precision that shamed native speakers, and who understood the British legal and political mind better than any other Asian leader of his generation. But this intimacy was a double-edged sword. Because he knew the British so well, he knew exactly how they operated. He knew that behind the polite veneer of tea diplomacy and the stiff upper lip lay a ruthless machinery of intelligence gathering that had kept the empire running for centuries. Lee Kuan Yew knew that the British did not have friends, they had interests, and he knew with absolute certainty that the British intelligence services, MI6 and the Domestic Special Branch, had been building a file on him since the moment he first stepped onto the political stage in the 1950s. In the early days of his career, when he was a firebrand lawyer representing trade unions and flirting with the radical left to gain independence, Lee was a primary target of the Special Branch. He was watched, followed, and analyzed. Later, when he became the Prime Minister and partnered with the British to crush the communists, he was invited inside the machine. He saw the files. He saw the transcripts of wiretaps used against his enemies. He saw how the British colonial police used information as a weapon to blackmail, leverage, and destroy political opponents. This experience was his education in the dark arts. When Singapore became independent and the Union Jack was lowered for the final time, Lee Kuan Yew did not naively assume that the surveillance stopped. He knew that an intelligence agency does not simply burn its files and go home just because a new flag is flying. He operated on the grim assumption that the British had left their eyes and ears behind, embedded in the very infrastructure of the new state. The physical reality of Singapore in the 1960s supported this fear. The uncomfortable truth was that the entire nervous system of the Singaporean government, the telephone lines, the switching stations, the radio masts, had been built, installed, and maintained by British engineers. The Singapore Telephone Board was a child of the colonial administration. The technology was British, the protocols were British, and in many cases the senior technicians were still British expatriates or locals trained by them. Lee Kuan Yew realized that he was governing a country where the master's house was wired by the master. Every time he picked up the heavy black bakelite receiver in his office to make a call to a minister, he had to assume that the signal was being routed through a switchboard where MI6 could easily place a passive tap. It was a terrifying vulnerability. The man fighting for sovereignty was forced to communicate through a network owned by the former colonizer. This distrust crystallized around a specific location, Eden Hall. This sprawling, white colonial mansion was the official residence of the British High Commissioner in Singapore. It was the epicenter of British soft power, a place of garden parties, gin and tonics, and polite diplomatic pressure. But to Lee Kuan Yew, Eden Hall was a listening post disguised as a home. During the tense negotiations for independence and the subsequent withdrawal of British troops, meetings at Eden Hall were frequent. Lee suspected that the British were desperate to know his bottom line. How much would Singapore pay for British defense? How desperate was Lee for economic aid? Lee became convinced that the study, the dining room, and perhaps even the garden of Eden Hall were saturated with listening devices. He believed that the British High Commissioner was not just relying on his notes, but on transcripts provided by intelligence officers who listened to every whisper, every pause, and every inflection of Lee's voice during these high-stakes negotiations. The Eden Hall complex became a metaphor for his relationship with London. He respected the British, but he treated them as a dangerous uncle who would steal your wallet while patting you on the head. He knew that the British were obsessed with the loyalty of their former subjects. Were they drifting toward the Americans? Were they getting too close to the Japanese? The MI6 station in Singapore was one of the largest in the region, and its primary mandate was to ensure that Singapore remained within the British sphere of influence. Lee Kuan Yew decided that he would not give them the satisfaction of knowing his mind. He began to treat every conversation in a British-built building as a public broadcast. When he spoke on the phone to British officials, he was guarded, specific and performative, knowing that the tape was likely rolling. He saved his real thoughts for the open air. To combat this enemy at home, Lee Kuan Yew initiated a tactical regression. In an era where the world was moving toward instant electronic communication, the Prime Minister of Singapore went backward in time. He realized that the only communication technology that could not be hacked by a British engineer was a piece of paper carried by a loyal man on a motorcycle. He instituted a rigorous system of physical couriers for all sensitive government business. The red box, the famous briefcase used by ministers, became the symbol of this secure network. If Lee wanted to send a memo to his defense minister about a secret arms deal with Israel, or a note to his finance minister about currency stabilization, he would not discuss it over the phone. He would write it down, seal it in an envelope with wax or tamper-evident tape, and hand it to a trusted dispatch rider. These dispatch riders became the unsung heroes of Singapore's counter-espionage strategy. They crisscrossed the island on their motorbikes, weaving through traffic, carrying the secrets of the state in leather pouches. It was a system of security through obsolescence. MI6 could tap a phone line from a remote listening post in comfortable air conditioning, but to intercept a dispatch rider, they would have to physically knock him off his bike and steal the bag in broad daylight, an act of war that not even the British would dare. Lee Kuan Yew effectively took the state's nervous system off the grid. He compartmentalized information. He ensured that the telephone was used only for administrative banalities, scheduling, logistics, public matters. The heart of the government, the strategic thinking, was kept strictly analog. This reversion to paper and ink was also a psychological play. It signaled to the British that Lee Kuan Yew was not a puppet who could be monitored like a delinquent child. By refusing to use their technology, he was rejecting their control. He was asserting that Singaporean secrets were no longer British property. The British intelligence officers, sitting in their listening stations with their headphones on, must have been frustrated to hear hours of silence or mundane chatter, knowing that the real decisions were whizzing past them on the streets below, locked in a box on the back of a motorcycle. Lee Kuan Yew's paranoia regarding the British was the foundation of his later defense against the Americans. He learned the lesson early. The people who build the walls know where the cracks are. And if you want to keep a secret in a house built by spies, you don't speak. You write, you seal, and you send. By the time the 1970s arrived, the nature of the invisible war in Singapore had fundamentally shifted. The British, with their old-school reliance on tapped telephone wires and human informants, were slowly being eclipsed by a new, far more terrifying leviathan, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. If the British were the masters of the analog age, the Americans were the architects of the digital future. The CIA brought with it a budget that dwarfed the GDP of many small nations and a technical services division that was turning the stuff of science fiction into the reality of statecraft. Lee Kuan Yew, ever the astute observer of power dynamics, recognized this shift immediately. He understood that the threat to his privacy was no longer just a physical wire connected to a switchboard. The air itself had become a conductor for espionage. The Americans did not need to break into a building to steal its secrets. They had developed the technology to strip mine information from a distance, turning the very architecture of sovereignty into a liability. The primary instrument of this new electronic siege was the directional microphone, often referred to in intelligence circles as the Big Ear. Kuan was acutely aware of the geography of his own power. The Astana, while secluded in its parkland, was surrounded by the rising skyline of a modernizing city. To the average citizen, the skyscrapers of Singapore were symbols of economic triumph. To the CIA, they were high-altitude observation posts. Lee knew that a parabolic microphone, equipped with the latest amplification technology, could be positioned on a balcony or a rooftop half a mile away. These devices worked on the principle of focusing sound waves onto a single point, much like a magnifying glass focuses light. In the dense, humid air of Singapore, sound traveled. A conversation held on a veranda, a command shouted to an aide in a courtyard, or even a discussion near an open window could be snatched out of the air, amplified, and recorded by a technician sitting comfortably in a van or a hotel room blocks away. The Big Ear meant that the perimeter of security was no longer the fence line of the palace. The perimeter was the line of sight. If they could see you, they could potentially hear you. But the Big Ear was a crude tool compared to the piece of technology that truly haunted Lee Kuan Yew's strategic calculus, the laser microphone. By the mid-1970s, intelligence reports and technical journals, which Lee read with the voracious appetite of a man under siege, began to describe a technology that seemed to defy the laws of privacy. The principle was terrifyingly elegant. When a person speaks inside a room, the sound waves created by their voice travel through the air and impact the solid surfaces around them. Walls are too thick to vibrate significantly, but glass is different. A window pane acts like a diaphragm. It vibrates in sympathy with the human voice. These vibrations are microscopic, invisible to the naked eye and imperceptible to the touch, but they are there. The CIA had developed a system where an infrared laser beam, invisible to the human eye, could be fired from a distance at a window pane. The beam would bounce off the glass and return to a receiver. As the glass vibrated from the speech inside the room, it modulated the reflected laser beam. The receiver would then decode these modulations, translating the vibrations back into audio. This technology fundamentally changed the rules of the game. It meant that a closed window was no longer a barrier. It was a transmitter. The soundproof glass, the heavy curtains, the double glazing, none of it mattered if the outer surface of the glass could be painted with a laser. Lee Kuan Yew realized that his office, the sanctuary where he made the decisions that determined the fate of the nation, had been transformed into a broadcasting booth. Every time he spoke to a minister near a window, he had to assume that his words were being transcribed in Langley, Virginia. The realization was chilling. It meant that the only way to be safe was to be in a room with no windows, a bunker buried deep underground. But Lee was a man of the tropics, a man who drew energy from the environment. He refused to govern from a cave. He was faced with a technological encirclement that seemed to have no defense. Lee Kuan Yew's response to this threat was driven by his intellect. He did not dismiss these technologies as rumors. He studied them. He became a student of surveillance countermeasures. He understood the physics of sound better than many of his generals. He knew that the laser microphone relied on a signal-to-noise ratio. It needed a relatively clean vibration from the glass to decode the voice. If the window was vibrating from other sources, traffic, heavy machinery, air conditioning condensers, the laser would pick up a garbled mess. He scrutinized the layout of the Astana. He looked at the angles of incidents from neighboring buildings. He realized that the sheer modernization of Singapore, the very glass and steel canyons he was building, were creating an echo chamber that favored the spy. The reflection of the laser could be bounced off multiple surfaces. The city was becoming a trap. The dilemma facing Lee was not just technical, it was deeply diplomatic. He was caught in a bind of plausible deniability. He could not simply pick up the phone and call the American ambassador to demand that the CIA stop aiming lasers at his windows. If he did so, the Americans would simply deny it. They would feign outrage, claim that they were allies, and suggest that the Prime Minister was suffering from paranoia or stress. Without physical proof, without catching an agent holding the laser gun, Lee would look weak and accusatory. He would damage the critical relationship with the United States for nothing. The Americans relied on the fact that their technology was invisible. They knew the victim couldn't complain about what he couldn't see. Lee understood that he could not fight this battle in the diplomatic arena. He could not ask them to stop. He had to make it physically impossible for them to succeed. This intellectual confrontation with the Great Brother technology forced Lee to rethink the concept of a secure space. He realized that the traditional defenses of the state, guards, fences, encryption, were obsolete against a beam of light. He had to think laterally. If the window was the traitor, he had to remove the window from the equation. If the air inside the room was compromised, he had to move the conversation to where the air was chaotic. He began to understand that the clean silence of a modern office was actually a liability. Silence isolates the voice. In a quiet room, the voice is the only source of vibration. In a noisy environment, the voice is buried. This led him to the counterintuitive conclusion that safety lay in chaos. He began to test the limits of these technologies in his own mind. He knew that lasers required a stable reflection. A moving target is harder to hit. A target surrounded by acoustic chaff is harder to decipher. The obsession with the big ear and the laser drove him to analyze the acoustic footprint of his entire administration. He wasn't just worried about his own office. He worried about the cabinet room, the Ministry of Defense, the private residences of his key lieutenants. He realized that the CIA's capability was omnipresent. They didn't need to bug every room. They just needed to bug the right room at the right time. The efficiency of the American machine was ruthless. They were vacuuming up data, sifting for weaknesses, looking for the cracks in the Singaporean armor. Lee Kuan Yew's genius lay in his refusal to be intimidated by the science. Many leaders of the Third World in that era were awed by American technology, assuming it was magic that could not be defeated. Lee viewed it as engineering, and engineering has limits. He knew that every machine has a point of failure. The laser microphone was expensive, finicky, and required a direct line of sight. The parabolic mic was confused by wind and background noise. He decided to exploit these weaknesses. He would not try to build a better shield. He would change the battlefield. He would take the game away from the realm of high-tech optics and bring it back to the realm of biology and physics. He would use the wind, the trees, and the water, elements that no CIA engineer could control, to drown out the electronic eyes and ears of the superpower. The decision to move to the gardens was not a retreat to nature. It was a tactical deployment of environmental countermeasures against the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in human history. The solution to the electronic siege of the Astana was not found in a catalogue of expensive counter-surveillance equipment, nor was it born in a laboratory of white-coated technicians. It was discovered through a ruthless application of the laws of physics and a profound understanding of the chaotic nature of the real world. Lee Kuan Yew, faced with the invisible threat of laser microphones and parabolic big ears, realized that trying to block the signal was a losing battle. The CIA could always build a stronger laser or a more sensitive receiver. Instead of trying to build a better wall, Lee decided to dissolve the target. He moved the theater of statecraft from the controlled static environment of the boardroom to the unpredictable acoustic anarchy of the garden. To the casual observer, a walk in the park seemed like a quaint, perhaps even eccentric habit of a leader seeking fresh air. In reality, it was a deployment of low-tech asymmetrical warfare that rendered millions of dollars of American spy gear effectively useless. The first principle of the garden strategy was the physics of sound dispersion. Lee Kuan Yew understood that the greatest enemy of privacy is containment. In a closed office, sound waves are trapped. They bounce off the hard surfaces of walls, ceilings, and windows, creating a reverberant field that sustains the energy of the voice. A microphone hidden in a vent or a laser pointed at a vibrating window relies on this containment to capture a clear signal. However, the moment a conversation moves outdoors, the physics changes entirely. There are no walls to reflect the sound. The energy of the human voice, which is relatively weak to begin with, radiates outward in a sphere. According to the inverse square law of physics, the intensity of that sound diminishes exponentially with distance. In an open garden, the voice does not linger. It escapes. It dissipates into the atmosphere, swallowed by the vastness of the sky. For a spy sitting in a van 500 meters away with a parabolic microphone, this dispersion is catastrophic. Without walls to focus the sound, the signal becomes faint, wispy, and fragile, barely registering above the threshold of silence. But Kuan did not rely on distance alone. He knew that modern amplifiers could boost even the faintest signal. He needed a jammer. In electronic warfare, jamming involves flooding a frequency with noise so that the true signal cannot be distinguished. The CIA used sophisticated electronic jammers to block radio transmissions. But Kuan used the ecosystem of Singapore. He recognized that the tropical environment provided a layer of white noise that was far more effective than any machine. The primary soldiers in this acoustic defense were the cicadas. In the heat of the day, the insects of the Astana grounds produced a relentless, high-pitched screeching that saturated the audio spectrum. To the human ear, the sound is annoying but filterable. The brain learns to ignore it. To a microphone, however, it is a wall of static. The frequency of the cicada's cry overlaps significantly with the upper frequencies of human speech, specifically the consonants that give words their definition. A recording of a conversation held near a tree full of cicadas often sounds like two ghosts whispering inside a jet engine. Lee layered this organic jamming with the urban pulse of the city. The Astana is an oasis of green, but it is located in the heart of a bustling metropolis. The low-frequency rumble of heavy traffic from Orchard Road, the distant wail of sirens, the thrum of construction machinery, and the rustle of the wind through the angsana trees created a complex, chaotic soundscape. This was acoustic chaff. A parabolic microphone is a dumb instrument. It amplifies everything in its path. It cannot distinguish between the Prime Minister's whisper and the roar of a passing bus. By forcing the CIA's listening devices to contend with this wall of ambient noise, Lee reduced their take to a garbled mess. He forced the American intelligence analysts to spend hours scrubbing tapes, trying to separate a coherent sentence from the sound of wind and insects, often failing to recover anything of intelligence value. He had effectively encrypted his speech using the environment itself. The third and perhaps most brilliant component of the strategy was the introduction of kinetics. Kuan never stood still. The garden meetings were not static picnics, they were forced marches. This was a direct countermeasure against the laser microphone. For a laser system to work, the beam must be kept perfectly steady on a specific point on a target surface, usually a window pane or a glossy object near the speaker. If the target is moving, the laser cannot lock on. In the garden, there were no windows to target, so a spy would have to attempt to bounce a laser off something the men were wearing, perhaps a pair of glasses or a watch face. But Kuan kept a brisk, relentless pace. He moved through the shadows of the trees, changing direction, stopping abruptly, and then starting again. This movement made him a ghost to the optical tracking systems of the era. Imagine the frustration of a CIA technician stationed in a high-rise building overlooking the Astana grounds. He has a line of sight to the Prime Minister. He has the most advanced laser equipment in the world, but he cannot get a reading. Every time he tries to focus the beam, Lee walks behind a tree. Every time he gets a lock, Lee turns a corner. The angle of incidence changes constantly. The reflection is lost. The target is fluid. Kuan understood that a moving target is the hardest thing to hit, whether with a bullet or a beam of light. He weaponized his own physical fitness. He was known to walk fast, forcing his guests, often softer, less fit diplomats, to huff and puff to keep up. This had the added psychological benefit of keeping the guest off balance. While the diplomat was worrying about catching his breath and wiping sweat from his eyes, he was less likely to be guarding his own tongue, while Lee remained cool, collected, and in total control of the dynamic. This walk-and-talk protocol became a legendary aspect of his governance. It was a physical manifestation of his philosophy that comfort was the enemy of security. He sacrificed the air-conditioned luxury of the office for the safety of the sweat. He understood that the humidity of Singapore, which most Westerners found oppressive, was his ally. The dense, moist air actually absorbs high-frequency sound waves more effectively than dry air, further dampening the audio signal before it could reach the CIA's listening posts. Every element of the environment was conscripted into the service of counter-espionage. The gravel underfoot crunched loudly, masking footprints and low whispers. The fountains were kept running, their splashing water creating a curtain of sound that shielded conversations held on the nearby benches. It was a holistic defense system that cost absolutely nothing to maintain but was impenetrable to electronic attack. The genius of this approach lay in its asymmetry. The United States and the Soviet Union were spending billions of dollars on satellite technology, micro-miniaturization of electronics, and signal processing computers. They were engaged in a technological arms race to see who could build the better bug. Kuan looked at this race and decided not to run in it. He stepped off the track entirely. He realized that technology has a blind spot. It relies on predictable parameters. It relies on the target behaving in a civilized, predictable manner, sitting in a chair, facing a window, speaking clearly. By behaving unpredictably, by embracing the chaos of the natural world, Lee rendered the technology irrelevant. He defeated the laser with a pair of walking shoes. He defeated the microphone with a cicada. It was a triumph of human intelligence over artificial intelligence. This strategy also revealed the depth of Kuan Yew's psychological dominance. He knew that the spies knew. He knew that somewhere in a van or a hotel room, American agents were cursing as they adjusted their headphones, hearing nothing but the screech of insects and the crunch of gravel. He derived a grim satisfaction from this. It was a way of asserting his sovereignty. By taking the conversation outside, he was effectively saying, "You may own the airwaves, you may own the telephone lines, but you do not own this ground." He was drawing a physical circle of privacy that the superpowers could not violate. It forced the intelligence agencies to rely on human intelligence, reports written by the diplomats themselves, which Lee could manipulate through his own charisma and argumentation. He stripped them of the raw data of the wiretap and forced them to deal with him man to man. In the end, the low-tech solution was a testament to Kuan Yew's adaptability. He was a man who modernized a nation, who believed in science and progress, yet he was never seduced by the illusion of technological security. He understood that the oldest tools are often the best. In the high-stakes poker game of the Cold War, where a single leaked secret could lead to a coup or an economic crash, Kuan Yew played his hand close to his chest, walking briskly under the angsana trees, surrounded by the deafening, protective roar of his own island, leaving the most powerful spies in the world holding expensive equipment that caught nothing but the wind. While the garden strategy was a brilliant improvisational response to the threat of surveillance, Kuan Yew was too pragmatic to believe that a modern nation could be governed entirely from a park bench. There were files to be read, maps to be studied, and sensitive telephone calls to be made that simply could not happen amidst the noise of cicadas and traffic. The business of state required an office, but the office was compromised. To reclaim the interior of the Astana from the electronic eyes and ears of foreign intelligence agencies, Lee launched a counter-offensive that was as aggressive and methodical as any military campaign. He understood that he could not rely on the local police or the standard maintenance crews to secure his workspace, for they lacked the sophistication to detect the cutting-edge technology of the CIA or MI6. Furthermore, he could not ask the British or the Americans for help, as they were the primary suspects. Instead, he turned to the shadows, recruiting teams of electronic warfare specialists from nations that shared his obsession with secrecy and survival. While the official records remain sealed, the footprint of this operation points unmistakably to the involvement of Israeli Shin Bet technicians, the same Mexicans who had built the army, or perhaps experts from Switzerland, the world's vault. These were the sweepers, men who arrived in Singapore with suitcases full of frequency scanners, non-linear junction detectors, and X-ray equipment, tasked with the mandate to sanitize the heart of the Singaporean government. The process of sweeping the Prime Minister's office was not a gentle inspection. It was a forensic dismantlement. The technicians treated the room as a crime scene. They moved inch by inch, scanning the radio frequency spectrum for the faint pulsing signals that betray the presence of a transmitter. They ran currents through the telephone lines to detect the telltale voltage drops of a parasitic tap, but they did not stop at the electronics. They tore into the physical fabric of the building. Wall sockets were unscrewed and analyzed under microscopes to see if the wiring had been manipulated. Ceiling tiles were removed to check for microphones hidden in the air conditioning ducts, a favorite trick of the CIA, as the metal ducts acted as waveguides, carrying sound from the room to a listening post on the roof. The wallpaper was checked for foil bugs, paper-thin microphones that could be pasted behind the decor. Even the furniture was suspect. The mahogany desks and leather chairs were X-rayed to ensure that no batteries or transmitters had been embedded in the wood during manufacturing or maintenance. It was a tedious, expensive, and destructive process, but for Lee Kuan Yew, it was the price of sovereignty. He would rather sit in a room with torn drywall than in a room with a working microphone. However, Lee knew that a sweep is only a temporary victory. A room that is clean today can be compromised tomorrow by a bribed janitor or a maintenance worker. To create a permanent sanctuary, he ordered the construction of what intelligence professionals call a SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. In the parlance of the Singaporean government, these became the cone of silence. These were rooms built within rooms, designed to defy the laws of physics that spies rely on. The construction of these secure zones was an engineering marvel. The walls were not just brick and mortar, they were lined with heavy copper mesh creating a Faraday cage. This conductive enclosure blocked all electromagnetic fields. A radio signal could not enter, and more importantly, a radio signal could not leave. If a spy managed to sneak a transmitter into the room, it would be useless, unable to punch its signal through the copper shield. The acoustic defenses of the cone of silence were equally formidable. The room was floated, meaning the floor, walls, and ceiling were separated from the main structure of the building by rubber shock absorbers. This prevented sound vibrations from traveling through the concrete to the rest of the building, defeating the contact microphones used by the Russians and the British. The windows, if there were any at all, were fitted with acoustic glass inches thick and equipped with white noise transducers that vibrated the glass intentionally, rendering laser microphones useless. Inside this sterile, copper-lined box, the air felt different. It was dead silent, cut off from the hum of the city and the electronic noise of the world. Here, finally, Lee Kuan Yew could speak. He could discuss the capabilities of the new Israeli tanks, the fragility of the Malaysian coalition, or the real numbers of the Singaporean reserves without fear that the conversation was being transcribed in Langley or London. But technology was only half of the equation. Lee Kuan Yew knew that the weakest link in any security system is always the human element. A Faraday cage is useless if a visitor walks in with a recording device in their pocket. Consequently, the paranoia that had driven him into the garden was codified into a rigid, almost monastic protocol for anyone entering his inner sanctum. The screening process for visitors became legendary. It did not matter if you were a senior cabinet minister, a foreign dignitary, or a close friend. When you entered the secure zone, you were stripped of your electronic identity. The anteroom to Lee's office became a checkpoint. The protocols were specific and rooted in a deep knowledge of Cold War spycraft. Lee knew that the CIA's Technical Services Division had miniaturized microphones to the point of absurdity. A fountain pen could hold a recorder. A wristwatch could hold a transmitter. A pair of thick-rimmed glasses could house a camera. Therefore, nothing was allowed in. Briefcases had to be left outside. Pens were provided by the office, simple plastic sticks that had been taken from a secure box. Watches were often asked to be removed. Lee Kuan Yew was particularly suspicious of gifts. In the world of diplomacy, it is customary to exchange tokens, clocks, desk ornaments, framed pictures. Lee treated these gifts as Trojan horses. He knew of cases where the Soviets had gifted a wooden carving of the Great Seal of the United States to the American ambassador in Moscow, which hung in the embassy for years, concealing a passive listening device that required no power source. In Lee's Singapore, gifts were politely accepted, scanned, and then often relegated to a warehouse or a non-sensitive area, never to be placed near the seat of power. This regime of vigilance transformed the atmosphere of the Prime Minister's office. It created a culture of security first that permeated the entire administration. Civil servants learned quickly that carelessness with information was not just a professional lapse, it was a betrayal of the state. The clean desk policy was enforced rigorously. No papers were to be left out, no safes left unlocked. The shredder became as important as the typewriter. Lee Kuan Yew himself set the standard. He was disciplined to the point of obsession. He did not gossip on the telephone. He did not hold sensitive meetings in hotel rooms when traveling abroad, assuming that every hotel in a major capital was wired by the host intelligence service. He would often play loud music or turn on the television in his hotel suite to disrupt potential listeners, creating his own portable noise-jamming system. The electronic battle for the Astana was a war of attrition. It required constant updates as the spy technology evolved from analog to digital, from radio waves to fiber optics. Kuan kept his teams on the cutting edge, authorizing the purchase of the latest counter-surveillance gear from Switzerland and Israel. He created a bubble of silence in the center of a noisy world. To the outsider, these measures might have seemed excessive, the actions of a man consumed by distrust. But to Li, they were the rational actions of a man who understood the stakes. He knew that information was the currency of survival. If the Malaysians knew his military weakness, they might invade. If the Americans knew his economic desperation, they might squeeze him in trade talks. By sealing the leaks, by sweeping the walls, and by building his copper-lined cages, Kuan ensured that when he sat across the table from the great powers, he held his cards tight against his chest. The silence of his office was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of secrets kept safe, a testament to a leader who built a fortress not just of concrete, but of discipline and silence. The most sophisticated weapon in Kuan Yew's counter-espionage arsenal was not the copper-lined walls of his safe room or the screaming cicadas of the Astana gardens. It was his own mind, and specifically, his wicked, calculated sense of humor. While he spent considerable resources blocking the electronic eyes and ears of foreign powers, he understood that total silence was impossible. There would always be a leaked document, a compromised phone line, or a microphone that the sweepers missed. Instead of fearing this inevitability, Li decided to turn it into a form of psychological warfare. He transformed the very act of being spied upon into a diplomatic weapon, using his awareness of the surveillance to unsettle, confuse, and ultimately dominate the men who were sent to watch him. He moved beyond the defensive posture of the victim and adopted the offensive posture of the gamesman. He did not just hide from the spies, he trolled them. The theater of this psychological war often played out in the formal setting of diplomatic meetings, particularly with the ambassadors of the United States and Great Britain. These were high-stakes encounters where every word was weighed and every gesture analyzed. The foreign diplomats would arrive at the Prime Minister's office, armed with briefing papers prepared by their intelligence officers, confident in their secret knowledge of Singapore's internal affairs. They believed they held the upper hand, the hidden ace of superior information. Kuan Yew would let the conversation flow normally for a while, discussing trade tariffs or regional security. Then, with the timing of a seasoned actor, he would disrupt the script. He would pause in the middle of a sensitive sentence, look deliberately at the ceiling, or stare intently at the telephone sitting on his desk. A thin, knowing smile would play on his lips, and he would deliver a line that shattered the diplomatic pretense. "I suppose I should speak louder," he would say, his voice dripping with dry sarcasm, "so that your colleagues in the van outside don't miss anything." Or when picking up the phone to make a call in the presence of an envoy, he might quip, "I hope the tape is rolling because I don't want to repeat this." The effect of these gestures was immediate and devastating. For the diplomat sitting across from him, it was a moment of profound professional embarrassment. Diplomacy relies on the polite fiction of mutual trust. By acknowledging the elephant in the room, the fact that friendly nations were aggressively spying on each other, Li stripped away the veneer of civility. He forced the ambassador to confront the reality of their relationship. It was not a partnership of equals, but a predatory game of intelligence gathering. The ambassador would often flush, stammer a denial, or laugh nervously, but the power dynamic had shifted. Li had seized control. He had signaled that he was not a naive third-world leader who could be patted on the head and manipulated. He was fully aware of the machinery operating in the shadows. He was telling them to their faces, "I see you." But the impact went far beyond the discomfort of a single ambassador. The real target of these mind games was the intelligence apparatus back in the embassies and in the headquarters of the CIA in Langley and MI6 in London. In the world of intelligence analysis, context is everything. A spy agency values unwitting information above all else. When a target speaks freely on a phone line they believe is secure, they reveal their true intentions, their fears, and their weaknesses. This is the gold standard of intelligence. However, the moment the target becomes witting, the moment they know they are being listened to, the value of that information collapses. It becomes tainted. If Kuan Yew knew the phone was tapped, then everything he said on that phone became suspect. Was he telling the truth, or was he performing? Was he feeding the listeners a carefully constructed lie to lead them down the wrong path? This created a wilderness of mirrors for the Western intelligence agencies. Lee Kuan Yew introduced the poison of doubt into their data stream. If the CIA intercepted a call where Lee complained about being terrified of a Malaysian invasion, they had to ask themselves, is he really terrified? Or does he want us to think he is terrified so that we will sell him more weapons? If he spoke about opening a naval base to the Soviet Union, was it a genuine strategic pivot, or was it a bluff designed to panic the Americans into offering more aid? The analysts in Washington found themselves in a paralysis of analysis. They could no longer trust their own ears. By simply looking at the ceiling and making a joke, Lee Kuan Yew had effectively encrypted his intentions without using a single mathematical code. He forced the spies to second-guess every piece of data they collected. He turned their expensive technological advantage into a liability, forcing them to spend countless man-hours debating whether the Prime Minister was telling the truth or playing them for fools. This strategy of aggressive awareness served another purpose. It fed disinformation directly into the enemy's decision-making loop. Lee was a master of the calculated leak. There were times when he would use a line he knew was compromised to vent frustration about a particular issue, perhaps a trade dispute or a military procurement problem. He would speak with great passion and anger, knowing the Americans were listening. He knew that the transcript of that call would be on the desk of the Secretary of State within hours. By the time the official negotiations began the next day, the Americans would be already primed to offer concessions, believing they were soothing an angry ally. They thought they were manipulating him using stolen intelligence, when in reality, he was manipulating them using the very channel they had stolen. He used their big ear to whisper exactly what he wanted them to hear. This intellectual cat-and-mouse game earned Lee Kuan Yew a rare and grudging respect within the global intelligence community. In the 1960s and 70s, the CIA and MI6 were used to dealing with leaders in Asia, Africa, and Latin America who were either easily bought, easily frightened, or blissfully ignorant of modern tradecraft. They were used to toppling governments and installing puppets. Lee Kuan Yew was a different breed entirely. He was classified as a hard target. He was a man who read their manuals, understood their technology, and possessed a psychological resilience that made him impervious to standard intimidation tactics. The CIA station chiefs in Singapore came to realize that they were not dealing with a client, they were dealing with a grandmaster. They respected him because he played the game by their rules, and often played it better. The acknowledgement of this respect often came in quiet moments. Retired intelligence officers from that era would later speak of Lee with a tone of professional admiration. They admitted that while they had files on everyone, the file on Lee Kuan Yew was filled with question marks. He remained an enigma, a man who could be heard but never truly known. His tactic of open mockery served to inoculate him against the condescension of the West. It established Singapore not as a pawn, but as a player. By looking at the ceiling and winking at the spies, Lee Kuan Yew asserted his intellectual independence. He proved that while a superpower might have the budget to buy the world's best microphones, it could not buy the insight to understand a leader who refused to be defined by their secrets. He showed that the ultimate countermeasure to espionage is not silence, but the courage to let the enemy know that you are watching them, watching you. The history of statecraft is littered with the graves of leaders who believed that a handshake and a smile were enough to guarantee their safety. Lee Kuan Yew survives in the pantheon of great statesmen because he never succumbed to that illusion. His paranoia, often mocked by Western critics as the eccentricity of an authoritarian, was in reality the supreme virtue of his governance. It was not a flaw, it was a survival mechanism. As the decades passed and the Cold War thawed into a complex multipolar world, the vindication of Lee's approach became absolute. The archives of the CIA, MI6, and the KGB, slowly declassified over time, have revealed that his suspicions were never unfounded. They were listening. They were watching. The laser microphones were real. The tapped lines were real. The friendly diplomats with hidden agendas were real. By treating every wall as an ear and every window as an eye, Lee Kuan Yew did not lose his mind. He saved his country. He ingrained a lesson into the DNA of Singapore that remains its guiding principle. In the jungle of geopolitics, The small animal that sleeps with both eyes closed does not wake up. This philosophy, that survival depends on eternal vigilance, has transcended the man and become the operating system of the nation. Lee Kuan Yew's legacy is not just the skyline of Marina Bay or the bustling port. It is the invisible shield that wraps around the island. The garden strategy of the 1970s, where privacy was bought with sweat and cicadas, has evolved into the digital fortress of the 21st century. Today, Singapore is recognized globally not just as a financial hub, but as a titan of cybersecurity. It is no accident that a tiny island with no natural resources is one of the premier locations for data centers and high-tech research. The obsession with information security that drove Lee into the garden has morphed into a national doctrine of digital sovereignty. The modern Singaporean state treats its data with the same jealous guarding that Lee treated his conversations. The Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, CSA, and the sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities of the armed forces are the spiritual successors of those dispatch riders on motorcycles. They are built on the same foundational truth. The world is looking for a crack, and it is our duty to ensure they never find one. The transition from the analog threats of the Cold War to the digital threats of the cyber age has only validated Lee's worldview. He understood before many others that information is the ultimate currency of power. He taught his people that reliance on foreign technology is a necessary evil that must be managed with extreme caution. The Smart Nation initiative of modern Singapore is built on a bedrock of skepticism. It uses Western technology, but it wraps it in layers of local encryption and verification. It follows the maxim that Lee lived by: trust, but verify. And if you are dealing with a superpower, do not trust at all. This is why Singapore maintains its own distinct digital identity, refusing to be fully absorbed into the technospheres of either the United States or China. It stands apart, a digital Switzerland, a neutral vault where the locks are built by locals who learn from the master that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. In the final analysis, the story of Lee Kuan Yew and the Spies is a triumph of the human element over the machine. The United States spent billions of dollars developing satellite constellations, laser interferometry, and supercomputers to penetrate the secrets of the Third World. They built an empire of surveillance designed to make privacy obsolete. And yet, they were defeated by a man walking on gravel. The image of Lee Kuan Yew in the garden serves as a timeless metaphor for the limits of imperial power. It is a picture of David and Goliath, but instead of a sling, David holds only his own counsel. It is the image of a man small in stature, but immense in intellect, pacing beneath the angsana trees, using the chaotic, uncontrollable noise of nature to defeat the precision of American engineering. Ultimately, Lee Kuan Yew proved that sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. It is about the sanctity of the mind. By refusing to let the CIA into his head, by refusing to let his private thoughts become public intelligence, he preserved the dignity of his office and the independence of his decision-making. He showed the world that a small nation does not have to be an open book for the great powers to read at their leisure. As the sun sets over the Astana today, the gardens are still there, the cicadas still scream in the heat, and the traffic still rumbles in the distance. The man is gone, but the silence he carved out of the noise remains. It is a silence that speaks louder than any speech, a testament to the paranoid genius who looked at the sky, knew the invisible eyes were watching, and simply invited his guests to take a walk, leaving the most powerful spies in history holding nothing but the wind.